Loops allow you to run the same code multiple times. I'm going to talk to you about a while loop that runs while a specified condition is true and stops once it's no longer true. So we are going to push the digits 0 through 4 onto this array. Here's how it's going to work. While is the while loop, while I is less than 5. And we're going to do something while that's true. First, we have to set what I starts off at. So var I equals 0. So while I is less than 5, we'll do my array dot push I. Just push it onto the array, and to make sure this loop eventually ends, I'll have to do I plus plus, which increments I. So then I will test this out by doing console.log, and I'm going to console.log the my array. So let's see if this works. I'll run this and check the console. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. The while loop worked. Every time it went through this 5 different times and pushed 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 onto the loop. A for loop is the most common type of loop in JavaScript. So here is an example of a for loop. You start with the keyword for, and then we have these parentheses with 3 different items in there separated by semicolons. The first thing is the initialization, then we have the condition, then we have the final expression. So the initialization happens before any of the code inside the loop runs. So we will start by initializing I to equal 0. So this is what most for loops start with, is you have a variable that you're going to initialize for the for loop. Then the next thing is the condition. So once this evaluates to false, we break out of the loop. So while I is less than 5, we'll continue to run through the loop over and over until this is false, and we break out of the loop. The final thing is what we do at the end of each iteration. At the end of each iteration, we will increment I by 1. In this example, we are filling our array with the numbers 0 through 4. I'm going to do another example where we fill an array with the numbers 1 through 5. So we'll start with 4. Now we're going to initialize I to equal 1. We're starting with 1 instead of 0 this time, and we're going to do I is less than 6. So while I is less than 6, or until I is more than 6, we are going to run all the code in this loop. And at the end of each iteration, we are going to increment I. Now, I can just do what we had before, my array dot push I. So the final thing we will do is test this. I will do console.log and put my array inside here. And I'll just load this and see what we see in the console. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It worked. We iterated 5 different times, and each time we pushed a new digit onto the array, and at the end of each iteration, we incremented I, so it pushed a larger number onto the array. Loops don't just have to increment one at a time. Look at this for loop here. We have our initialization where we initialize I to 0, and then we are going to run the loop until I is less than 10. And finally, our increment, instead of incrementing I by 1, we're incrementing I by 2. So now this is going to push all the even numbers onto the array. We have console.log, so let's log it out and see what it looks like. 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. I'm going to write another loop right now that creates an array of odd numbers. So let's do that. For var I equals 1, we'll start at 1, while I is less than 10, I can use 10 again. I'm going to do I plus equal 2. So we're still going to skip count by 2s, but since we're starting at 1 instead of 0, this should give us the odd numbers. So let's see what's going to be inside our loop. My array dot push, and I'll just put I there. So let's log this out and see if we did it right. Console.log my array, and I'll run that. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. It worked. A for loop can also be used to count backwards. So if we see this for loop here, we're initializing I to 10. We're starting at 10 and we're going back to 0. So we're going to iterate through this loop while I is more than 0. We're going to keep iterating. And at the end of each iteration, we're going to decrement I instead of increment it. We're going to go down by 2. I minus equals 2 means I equals I minus 2. So we're going to continue pushing the lower and lower numbers onto the array until I is less than 0. So let's log this out and see what our array becomes. You can see 10, 8, 6, 4, 2. Well, I'm going to write another one where we're going to push the odd numbers from 9 through 1 to my array. So another for loop, and I'm going to do var I equals 9 because we want to start at 9. Now we'll still do I is more than 0. So while I is more than 0, we're going to keep going through this array, and we'll do I, and everything else is really the same, minus equals 2. And this is going to get all the odd numbers onto the array. So we just have to do my array dot push, and then push on the I there. Now we'll just console.log so we can see what it ended up as. My array, and I'll run the code. 97531. We did it. It is common in JavaScript to iterate through the contents of an array. So look at this example. We have this array here. Before, we were always adding items to the array, but this time the array already exists. Right here, our array 9, 10, 11, 12. So we are going to start at 0, but now instead of going to a specific number of iterations, we are going to the array.length. So the length is 4 here, but if we added elements to this array, that means this loop would just go even longer until we went through every element of that array. And then at the end, we're going to increment I by 1 at the end of each iteration. So look what we're doing inside the array. We're doing our total that starts off at 0 up here, and we're doing plus equals. That means we're going to do our total equals our total plus something else. So we're going to keep adding to the total whatever is in the array at that index. So our array I. So it starts at 0, and then it goes 1, 2, 3 until it gets to 4, which is the length of the array, and it doesn't even run the iteration at 4, and there is no index 4 on the array. Remember, it's 0, 1, 2, 3. So this is just going to add up all those numbers. If we run this, we can see it adds up to 42. I'm going to write another for loop down here that's going to add up all the numbers in this array here. So we'll do for var I equals 0, and then we'll do I is less than my array dot length and I plus plus. So just like before, for each element in my array, we're going to do a total plus equals my array index I. So we have to initialize the total variable right up here. So we'll do var total equals 0, and then at the end we'll just console.log that out to see what the total is. So if I just run this, we can see that the total this time is 20. If you have a multidimensional or nested array, you can use nested for loops to access all the array elements. So for instance, we have this multiply all function. It's defined up here, but we're calling it here and we're passing in this multidimensional array, which is basically an array with arrays inside the array. So inside the first array, there are 3 elements, 1, 2, 3. And you can see each of those elements are an array with their own set of elements. So we are going to use nested for loops within this multiply all function to multiply every number in these nested arrays here. So let's get started. We're going to start with a for loop, and it's going to look just like the other for loops that we've started. I equals 0. We're going to initialize I to 0. And then we're going to say while I is less than r dot length, and then we're just going to increment I at the end of each iteration. Now, r dot length, that's going to start off as 3 because we're passing in this array, and the first level of the array, there's just 1, 2, 3 elements. So that's going to be 3. But now we're going to go inside this for loop and create another for loop. So we're going to do var j equals 0. Normally it's standard practice to call the variable that we're incrementing I, but we already have an I within this scope. So we need to create another name, and it's pretty standard to call the next variable j, because j is after I. So now we're going to do j while j is less than. Now this is where it gets a little tricky. We're going to do while a is less than r index I dot length. Also, we're going to increment j here. So this is going to change. So first, the first iteration of this outer for loop, we're looking at the length of this array. Then we're looking at the length of this array. Then we're looking at the length of this array. The index is going to be different every time, so we're going to be going to each different array inside the nested array. So at this point, we just have to multiply all the numbers together. So we already have the product that we've defined above. So we're going to do product times equals, which is just going to multiply everything together. And we're going to do r I j. So the I references the outer array, and the j references the inner array within what we're passing in. And now we're done. So we have the console.log here. So let's run this and see what happens. And 5040. Next, I'm going to talk about do while loops. Now, we already talked about while loops, and I'm going to review this while loop, and then I will tell you how a do while loop is different than a while loop. So this while loop first checks the condition before it runs any code within the loop. A do while loop will always run at least one time, and then it will check the condition. So here we have this empty array. We have I equals 10. So while I is less than 5, well, I is not less than 5, so it's not going to do anything. Let's see what happens. So we see it logged out 10 and then an empty array, because I started as 10 and my array started as this empty array. See, we're logging the I and my array. With a do while loop, it's different. So what I'm going to do is cut this line up here and put it at the end. And then at the beginning, I'm going to put the keyword do. In a do while loop, this is always run at least once before it checks the condition. So first it's going to do these things, and then it's going to check the condition. In this case, it's going to find out the condition is false, and it's going to break out of the loop. Let's see what happens here. See, now I is 11, and the array has the 10 added to it. This is a coding challenge. We have this array of objects in our contacts list. And you'll see each object is one of our contacts with a first name, a last name, a number, and likes. So these are key value pairs here. So what we want to do is create this lookup profile function where we pass in a name, this is the first name, and the property, and it's going to return the value of that property. For instance, if we pass in the name Kristen here, and we pass in the property of number, it should return unknown. If we pass in the first name of Sherlock up here, and we return the property, and we pass in the property of likes, it should return the array, intriguing cases, and violin. If the name that's passed in does not correspond to any context, then our function should return no such contact. And if there's no property, it should return no such property. So let's go to this function here and start creating it. So the first thing we're going to have to do is iterate through each element in the contacts list. So let's make a for loop. So for var I equals 0, while I is less than contacts length, and at the end of each iteration, we'll do I++ to increment that. So for each of these contacts, the first thing we're going to check is if the name is a name in this list. So if contacts I dot first name equals the name that was passed in. So we're checking each item to see if it was the name that was passed in. And if so, we're going to do something. Now, if not, we're going to do something else. So let's do that now. Remember, if the name that was passed in is not in the array, we're going to return no such contact. However, if it is in the array, we're going to do something else. If the name is in the contacts list, we're going to return the value of the property that was passed in. So return contacts I prop. So this will return the value of that property that was passed in. However, there is another case, which is if the property does not exist, we return no such property. So a fancy way in JavaScript of saying use this value if it exists, but otherwise use a different value is to use the OR operator. So we'll say return contact iProp, or if it doesn't exist, we're going to return no such property. Now, just so you know, there would be a way to do this without using this OR operator. As long as your code passes the requirements, that's all that's important. There's many ways of doing this. But let's check it. So right now we have our lookup profile. We're passing in a Kira, and we're trying to find the likes. And we're console.logging the data, and pizza, coding, brownie points. So what if we passed in something else? If we passed in Sherlock, we pass in last name, no such contact. Well, that's working because I spelled Sherlock wrong. This is E, so it's a good way to test that. Holmes. And the last thing we'll check is if we pass in a property that does not exist. I'll just say hello and no such property. So our function works. There is a simple way to create a random decimal number in JavaScript. It's with the math.random function. So we have this function here, which it says random function, and it's returning 0 currently. But we're going to use the math.random function. And you will see that when I run this, we have 0.238133741 and so on. So it's always going to be a number between 0, and it could be 0, between 0 and 1, but it could not be 1. Often you want a random whole number instead of a random decimal number. That can be accomplished with math.floor. We have math.floor here. This rounds down to the nearest whole number. So we pass in math.random times 20, and then we round down to the nearest whole number. This is going to create a random whole number between 0 and 19. Remember, math.random can never be 1. It can be 0, but it can never be quite 1. So when we multiply it by 20, we are going to get a number between 0 and 20, but not including 20. Then we round down, which will end up being 0 to 19. So let me show you another example where we're going to get a random whole number between 0 and 9. It's going to look just like this. So we're going to modify this function. So this math.random, we're going to pass that into math.floor. So I'll have to put the parentheses because we're passing it in to that function. and it's math.random times 10. And that's going to give us a random number between 0 and 9. So if I reload this, you can see 9, 5, 4, 1. Every time I load it, it's a different random number. You can also generate random whole numbers within a range. So look at this function here, our random range. It takes a minimum number and a maximum number, and then it just runs through this calculation here. So we have the math.random, and we multiply it by the max number minus the min number plus 1, and then we get the floor, which is rounding down, and we add all that to our minimum number. So this is just a calculation to get a random number between the min and max. So as practice, I'm going to rewrite it down here. So we have the random range, and instead of our min and our max, we have my min and my max. However, the equation is going to be the same. So we have math.floor. You can take a chance to actually just look over the equation and see if you can understand how it works. My max minus my min, and then we just have to do plus 1, and then this whole thing is going to be plus my min. So we already have this example test set up down here, random range between 5 and 15, and we're going to log it out here. So let's try that. 11, 6, 7. See, every number is between 5 and 15 whenever I run it. Another useful function is the parseInt function. It takes a string and returns an integer. A lot of times you want to make sure you're dealing with integers and not strings for different calculations and things like that. If the string cannot be converted into an integer, it returns NaN for not a number. So let me show you how it works. From this convert to integer function, we are going to return, and we're going to return the string, except we're going to convert it into an integer first. So we'll do parse int, and then I'll pass in the string. Now, it was a string because you can see here we're passing in the string of the 56, but it's going to return it as a number, an integer. The parseInt function can also be used with a radix. The radix specifies the base of the number in the string, such as base 2, or base 7, or base 8. Base 2 would be binary, so that's one of the most common ones to use. Now the default is base 10. That's what we use normally every day. But let me show you how that would work. We're going to convert this number, which is a binary number, to an integer. So we'll do return, and I will do the parse int. I'll pass in the string as before, but now we'll have a second argument after the comma, which is going to be the number 2. So instead of the default of base 10, we'll be passing it as base 2. So the computer knows that this is a binary number. I love the ternary operator. It's like a one-line if-else expression. Now, this is what it looks like. You have your condition, just like in an if statement, and then you would have a question mark. After the question mark, you have what's going to happen if the condition is true. Then you have a colon. Then you have what's going to happen if the condition is false. So we can replace an if-else statement like this into something using the ternary operator. So here we have this: if this condition is true, we're going to return true, else we're going to return false. Let's change this. So now we're going to use the ternary operator. So now it's just going to say return A equals B. That's the condition. Then we use the question mark. So if it's true, we're going to return true. And then we have a colon. And after the colon, we have what's going to happen if it's false, which is we're going to return false. Now, I'm going to be honest, you would never write a line like this in real life, because you could just write return A equals B, and this line's actually going to do the same thing as this line. However, I just wanted to give you a simple example of using the ternary operator. One of the great things about conditional or ternary operators is that you can nest them within each other, which gives them even more power. So we're going to write a function here, the function check sign, and it's going to return the string positive if this number is positive, negative if the number is negative, or 0. And we're going to use a nested conditional operator. So here it is, return, and first we're going to check if num is more than 0, and then we'll use the ternary operator. If so, the first thing after the question mark is if it's true. If it's true, we're going to return positive. If it's false, if the number is not more than 0, we'll do something else. But here's where we're going to have another ternary operator. We're going to check if num is less than 0. So if the number is less than 0, well, if that's true, we have to have the question mark for the ternary operator. If that's true, we're going to return negative. And if it's false, that's where the colon comes in, we're going to return 0. So let's do this check sign. I'm going to do a console.log so we can see what this returns here. And we can see this is going to return positive. If we have a negative number here, it's going to return negative. Or if we have a 0, it's going to return 0. Now you'll see that after this colon, we have an entire ternary operator. So if this is true, we just return positive. If it's false, then we do everything here, which is another ternary operator, where it checks if this is true, and if that's true, we return negative, and if it's false, we return 0. For a long time in JavaScript, if you were going to declare a variable, you had to use the var keyword. But starting with ES6 in 2015, we can now declare variables with let and const as well. Over the next few lessons, I will be talking about what let and const do that's different than var. But one of the things is that let does not let you declare a variable twice. So let's look at this example. We have var cat name equals Quincy, and then down here var cat name equals Bo. And if I just run this code, you'll see that nothing is happening. It's just allowing us to set the cat name twice and declare it twice with the var keyword. However, if we change this to let, we're going to change all the var to let, and you'll see that when we load it again, you'll see an error, duplicate declaration cat name. So this is good that it's creating this error, because you usually don't want to declare a variable 2 times in the same scope. So this allows your program to give you an error to tell you that you've done something wrong. Now you can still reset it. So if we didn't use the word let here, we could just set the cat name variable, and now we're not going to get an error. In this case, we're declaring the variable here to be Quincy, and we're setting the same variable to a new name here. This is one of a few reasons that many people only use let and const and never use var to declare variables. Another thing in this code that you can see is use strict. Now this enables strict mode, which catches common coding mistakes and unsafe actions. So a lot of people will use strict at the top of a full JavaScript file, or maybe just in a function to catch coding mistakes, such as if you create a variable and don't declare it with var, let, or const. Another major difference between the var and let keywords is that when you declare a variable with var, it is declared globally or locally if declared inside a function. However, let, the scope of let is limited to the block, statement, or expression that it was declared in. So let's look at this example here. If you see this code, we have this check scope function, and we're calling it down here, and it's setting I with a var here, a var keyword, to function scope. Then we're setting it to block scope in here. And you can see it's console.logging block scope. I is, and it says block scope. And when we get down here, function scope, it's still block scope. If we want this to be function scope down here, we're going to have to use let. So we would use let here, and then we would use let here. And if we run the code, now you can see in the console, block scope I is block scope, function scope I is function scope. So even though we set I to block scope here inside this block, now a block is just anything inside these squiggly braces here. So we set I inside this block to block scope, but then when we get out here, it's now back to function scope because of this up here. Here's another thing I want to show you. If this is, if we comment this line out and we change this to var, what do you think's going to happen? Well, let's run it and find out. Look, we set the var inside this block here to block scope, and it says block scope is block scope. But then when we're outside of the block, when we're outside of these squiggly braces here, we can still access I here, and it's set to block scope. But if this was a let, and we're declaring it inside this block, if we run that, now when we get outside the block, we get an error because it's not defined. So that's another reason why people use let instead of var, is so that they can make sure the variable is only defined in the area they want it to be defined in. But for now, I'll uncomment this out